I'm Jim Collison, and live from our virtual studios around the world, this is Gallup's Called to Coach, recorded on April 17th, 2020. Called to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you're listening live, love to have you join us in our chat room. There's a link to it right above me on the live page. If it's after the fact and you have a question, send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. Don't forget, if you're on YouTube, subscribe and hit the little like button. That actually helps us from a discoverability standpoint. We appreciate it. Robert Gapsa is our host today. Robert's a workplace consultant here at Gallup. And Robert, always great to have you. Welcome back to part 5 here on Called to Coach.
Thanks for having me, Jim. It's great to be back here, and I'm kind of disappointed that this will end our series here on the steps of building a strength-based culture. But it's been a lot of fun.
Let's relive it for just a second for folks who maybe are joining us for the first time. We've gone through the first 4. Just quickly summarize those for us.
Yeah, the first 4 steps. Step 1, always get that executive support, that executive sponsor. Hopefully, if it's the CEO, it's really important to get that kind of leadership view of, hey, strengths are important, and this is going to be a part of our culture. So we want to hear that voice. The second part of it is of course, if we're going to have a strength-based culture, is get everybody to understand and know their strengths. So have everybody take the assessment and establish that baseline and that common language and build excitement around it. Step 3 was getting a network of internal strengths coaches or maybe even strengths champions, but people who can advocate, support, provide resources, and coach around those strengths, because just having your top 5 is all fine and dandy, but coaches really help us turn those talents into real strengths and point them towards outcomes. And then the last session, we spoke about how do we put this into performance management, and why would we do that, and how is that gonna help? And really the sum of that is naturally when people are operating in their strengths, when people are doing their best every day, when you can get the best of them, you're going to get their best work and their best performance. And having those conversations and changing those conversations to be more positive and strength-based, as opposed to what current performance management systems tend to focus on deficit-based or fixing what's wrong or weaknesses with people. How can we improve you? Performance management can really get launched by integrating strengths into that and working with getting people at their best.
So for folks who've joined us live, they've heard you go through that rendition a couple times already. Maybe they've learned, maybe it's a little learning technique. As we think about step 5, what is that in the process? Is that important?
Step 5 in our process is now that you've kind of have this, your network is set up, you've got that support, people have taken the assessment, you're starting to see it become a part of a cultural groundswell. Maybe it has been, if it's been integrated into the performance management system, it's being talked about, conversations are changing, people are feeling it, they're seeing the behaviors. Then it's a matter of how do we just keep that momentum going? How do we take it forward? And we say, transform your learning programs. And now transform can sound like a little scary, and some organizations will think of this like transform means like change, redo, turn it upside down. We need to change our current program. I'm saying no, please don't do that. And they think that that's the first step, right? Well, if we're going to be strength-based, then we've got to change our culture. So let's change our learning. And let's change things right here. And we say, no, I think it's much more impactful that once people kind of feel that ground up, like talking about strengths, working with their teams, working with their managers, you kind of build an appetite, right, for strengths. People start really seeing the benefits, and they start feeling much more open and receptive. I call it kind of an aperture, right? It's like their aperture, like a camera, it just opens, and they're more willing. Because if you just to come in and want to say, hey, we're just going to change the learning programs, and that's going to be where we start, you're not going to get the buy-in, right? So I like to say, and as we see at Gallup, this is more of that last step. It's got to be something, when you're talking about a culture, it's got to be something that people are enthusiastic and excited about, but they have to see it, right? Culture is something that is lived. It really is. It's how do we show up every day? So if we show up and we live and we are seen to be strength-based and we're using our strengths and we can understand why certain people who have certain talents and strengths are doing certain things a certain way, or when I get phone calls for people asking me to brainstorm because they know I have ideation number one, or when I have trouble with creating a process or system, and I know that one of my colleagues who has talents in those areas, who's a great arranger and has high discipline, and I'll call and lean on them. When we start feeling and living that, it becomes part of the culture, because that's really what creates the culture, right? It's really just a combination of experiences that we all have together. So I mean, imagine, you know, being onboarded and being told that we have a strength-based culture, or seeing it in some way in the employer branding, and then showing up and it not being there, it not being seen, it not being talked about, it's not being visible. It's like it's a real letdown, right? So it really is important that it is lived, and part of that is through, I think, some of our learning programs. You know, you don't want to hear about it and then not see it in action. So this is a way to get things in action first, and then start to look at moving it into, you know, some of those learning and development programs, so that people aren't getting mixed messages and getting confused.
Robert, let me ask you on that really quick. We talked about this, I think, in part one, about doing an audit, right? This idea of maybe auditing through. What would you seen, or what have you seen from a best practice as we think about maybe some of those things that could be wearing down the organization, or the inconsistencies like you just talked about? Like, you know, you promote your strengths based, and then on the first month you never even hear it, or you know, you don't get the opportunity to do it, right? What's your recommendation on how do you go about that audit? I mean, what are just a few pointers on getting something like that started?
You know, you talk to people. You know, I think talking to different people, different stakeholders, look at what are the existing programs right now. What is our recruiting program look like? What are the practices for our hiring and our onboarding? How are we doing that? You know, I like to look at the entire. I do work in our employee experience area, right? So I like to look at the entire employee life cycle. And it's not like the employee experience starts on day one when they walk in the door. It starts long before that, right? When they first interact with your brand. So when I say, you know, do an audit, I think I look at what are all the touch points, and what are we telling people, and what are they hearing long before they even walk into the door on their first day. You know, it's a very emotional time when you're starting a new job, is onboarding, and then it continues on. You know, like onboarding isn't an orientation that happens in week 2. Onboarding, it lasts for months, sometimes over a year. People are still trying to figure out if they're in the right place. So you know, I think that audit has to really look at, are we first, what are we saying to people? You know, how are we promoting it? How are we communicating ourselves before they come here? And then once they do come here, how are we living it? Are we living it? Are we showing it? Is it coming up in meetings? Are we seeing it in newsletters? Is it in part of our communications? Do we have our email signatures? Is that working? Is it somehow part of our culture, or are we just saying that to get people to come here, right? And when you find gaps and you find certain areas that, not that they're wrong, but I think we find opportunities where, you know what, we could probably do something here. We can probably do something there. Maybe we have another touch point. Maybe we have another communication point where we can just weave in, not override, but weave in a little bit of that message on how important it is, and how our culture is based upon talents and strengths of people, as opposed to, you know, just getting work out of them and trying to fix what's wrong with them. You find those gaps, and then you figure out ways to change them. You know, identify those areas.
Yeah, you talked about the importance of communication here through this process. You mentioned some things like newsletters, or like we do, where it's in your email signature, or posted up on in your work area. What other things could organizations be doing as a best practice? What are some other ideas that might help them communicate this out?
I love this, man. The list goes on, right? It's such a long list. You know, whatever the organization's already doing, start there. If they have company newsletters, I have a client who has they do internal videos that show on monitors in break rooms and in hallways. They're able to put those into loops, just little things, fun things. She had a puppy, and she had a dog, and she had a little 3-minute video on what her dog's strengths were. His name is Walter, right? And they make it fun. Anything. You have a SharePoint site? Is there a company blog? Do you have a place where you use posters or bulletin boards. I've seen clients use screensavers, put it on their, like you said, their email signatures, name tags. I mean, I think the list goes on and on. It just depends on what they're already using. And then if they're not using something that you think is going to be effective or that you think that can help, brainstorm. Is there a place on our website? Is there when we're doing speaking engagements, do we mention it? Is it part of our communication? As we're developing our employee value proposition, are we weaving that into that message? Because our EVP is a very strong magnet. That's really what's telling the outside world who we are as a brand and as an employment brand. And I think putting it into any employment brand initiatives is critical, because people are looking for it, especially young people, especially newer people coming out of college. They're looking for that type of development. They're looking for people in organizations that want to know what's right with them, because they've heard and they've seen the opposite, right? And so it's very easy to kind of use that as, I think, as a great selling point. And it's not the only selling point, but try to put it into that. I mean, again, the list, some companies have Twitter and Instagram and social media. So I think, use it in any way you can. Don't overuse it, right? Walk before you run, but find out where you're communicating already and see where you can weave it into those messages.
Because of the role that I have here in the community, I get to see a lot of these kinds of things happening publicly, which is really super cool. I think of a great example. John Sexton over at Vibrant Credit Union is making public videos. They're kind of theme Thursday style. He's interviewing an individual talking about how they're using their themes. It's for the credit union. They publish them publicly, so you get some recognition, right, for that. And then it's a great opportunity for that organization to rally around that, right? It's from them, by them, made by them. It's faces that people recognize. And I think those are some great opportunities. Hannah Miller, we're going to interview her. She's from the UK. We're going to interview her in a couple weeks. She's making 2-minute, 3-minute videos on LinkedIn that she's describing these themes, right? And working in that way. And there's so many creative ways. And I think even having a few stories at a company's annual meeting, we call it State of the Company, right? But to have some very concrete examples where we bring strengths in, and this is why this is happening when we start doing recognition based on what they've completed based on their strengths and how we call that out, right? That kind of reinforces that as well. So what other actions would you suggest for coaches helping organizations? Any other or maybe just kind of review what we talked about?
I think starting, as far as where I would go, what actions that can be done is taking that audit, audit the internal programs, look for where areas of improvement or places that you might be able to kind of infuse or integrate strengths or coaching into what they're already doing. If they're weakness focused, how can we turn that into strength-based, approach? I think aligning internal and external messaging, make sure we have the why and the how behind strengths. It's not just, hey, we're doing strengths, but, we've got plenty of data points and case studies on why it works and how it really fuels engagement. That internal brand advocacy, building that internal kind of group, the tribe, so to speak, and whether they're coaches or strengths champions or just people that are passionate about it, build the contingency, build that group that can help kind of amplify the message. That's another thing that you can do relatively easily, right? Hey, folks, how can we get this going? Let's come up with some ideas, make things visible, I think you can. Another thing, ensure that employees and manager objectives are aligned with strengths. There's nothing more disheartening than when an employee is excited about talking about their strengths and their talents and wanting to develop them, and having a manager just not on the same page and really not seeing it as important and not supporting that can be really disheartening. So, I think getting that alignment is really critical, and making sure that it's not too siloed, because that could take the wind out of the sail. Right. And then finally, I think, as I just talked about, how can you put strengths into your employment brand? How can you showcase how can you use it as a differentiator? How can you make yourself look unique out there? Because people are selecting companies, they're choosing where they want to work long before they even fill out that application or submit their resume. They're looking and talking to people who work there, who have worked there, and if it's become part of your culture, the word will get out, and it'll become part of your brand. And that's going to do more work for you than your other recruiting efforts. I guarantee it's what people are talking about. So I would say those are my initial things that I know people can do pretty darn quickly.
Robert, in your work that you've done, is this a flip the switch and it's done in a week, or what's your advice? Just around that?
Don't I wish we could hand somebody a magic pill or a silver bullet, right, to make all that happen? Absolutely not, Jim. This takes like anything else, especially, yeah, you can flip a switch and have everybody take a strengths assessment, but to create a strength-based culture, to create any type of culture, it's not something that you can just establish and say, this is our new culture and this is the way we're going to do things. Culture kind of happens, right? Culture it's in a lot of ways, it's like your brand. It's the conversation between two people over coffee. It's how people interact and collaborate. It's how they show up. It's how they support. It's how the organization interacts with the community. It takes a lot of work, but to become strength-based, you have to start somewhere, and it does not happen overnight. But it's well worth the efforts, because we see the results, and companies that do it, they see it. They see the results in all of the things we talk about in engagement: lower absenteeism, lower turnover, right, higher productivity, higher profitability. All of those metrics, they do happen, but it doesn't happen overnight. No, it's a
I think sometimes we think culture is a statement, and it's actually a million conversations, right?
Yeah.
That's where culture happens. And so, you
right.
want to get more of those than less, speaking in those terms.
Absolutely.
And that takes a lot of consistency and a lot of work and a lot of effort to get that done. I think well worth it in the end as organizations move in that direction. Robert, thank you for being with us for this 5-part series.
Absolutely.
If you're catching this one as your first one, we have 4 more for you as we work through this. And we would love to have you kind of just work through that with us. I'll remind you, if you have any questions, you can always send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. Don't forget, you can get access to all our resources in our new Gallup Access. Easiest way to access that is gallup.com/CliftonStrengths, available there. If you sign in there, you'll go right onto the platform. Great way to do it. Don't forget to sign up for our Clifton Strengths community newsletter while you're there. We would love to have you join us on our social groups as well. Facebook.com/group/call-to-coach. And then join us on LinkedIn. Maybe you're not a Facebooker. Not everybody needs to be, by the way, but you can do it on LinkedIn as well. Search Clifton Strengths Trained Coaches, and we'd love to have you in that community as well. I want to thank you for joining us for this whole series. If you did listen to all 5, give yourself a badge, some kind. Yeah. And we appreciate you guys coming out. If you're joining us live, stay around for a smidgen of a post show. With that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.